Adolf Hitler was not a German, he was an Austrian. People often confuse that. He was a pretty unremarkable young man who kind of struggled with finding his way in life. He was a starving artist for a while, lived in a homeless shelter for about a year or two, and then eventually ended up in the military. He took part in the First World War, was decorated, and then came back to Austria and felt quite out of place. He got into politics and eventually helped found the Nazi Party, the National Socialist Party. And he became famous as a result of a book that he wrote called Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which is basically an anti-Semitic book. That's how he became famous in Germany in the 20s. The Holocaust was it was practiced by the Nazi Party in Germany, but the basis of the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, was not invented by the Nazis. This goes back centuries throughout Europe. And it was a culmination of several centuries of anti-Semitic dogma practiced by several European elites, governments, people, and so on and so forth. It was the decision eventually to remove all minorities, both political minorities and ethnic and religious minorities from Germany. And it just so happened that the largest minority at the time in Germany was Jews. The initial pogroms, initial action against Jewish Germans began in the 30s. As soon as Hitler took power, there were several anti-Jewish events that took place in Germany. People started finding it very hard to get documents for different things. Eventually, citizenship was taken away from Jews in Germany. They tried to kick them out, not to kill them. Not because they particularly cared about them, but because it was cheaper to just kick them out. But nobody would take them. In fact, that's kind of the unfortunate thing that many countries refused to take Jews. So it was like the collective consciousness of the world failed at that point. And eventually, after the war began, the Germans who had already started using extermination methods against primarily disabled people, and eventually German communists, expanded that program of extermination to target primarily Jews. They were removed from Germany. They were taken to the east, primarily in Poland, and that's where most of the extermination took place, in organized, systematic fashion. Ironically, it was mostly through the Soviet invasion of Eastern Europe, when the Soviets won the Battle of Stalingrad, and then eventually started chasing the Germans back to Berlin. On their way there, they liberated several concentration camps. And that's just because primarily most concentration camps were located east of Germany, not west of Germany. And there were also several concentration camps that were liberated by the Americans. And we had, in fact, amazingly shocking footage of some of the first examples of evidence of extermination of Jews. I mentioned before that the collective consciousness of the world failed during the Holocaust, and I mean that in a very serious sense. In the 30s, there were several conferences of world conferences of countries trying to figure out a solution to what they call the Jewish problem in Germany. And many Jews could see what was happening, could tell what was coming, and they wanted to leave, but they couldn't go anywhere. The British refused to take them, the Americans refused to take many of them, the French, and so on and so forth. I think the only country that actually offered to take some Jews was the Dominican Republic. They offered to take 5,000 people in a conference in the 30s. I forget what it was, but that's pretty much it. And so you could argue, not that, of course, the Jews in Germany were as Germans as anybody else. They had been there for centuries, and they should have stayed there. But those who wanted to leave, they had nowhere to go. Nobody would take them, And that's perhaps what we should remember, that it wasn't the Nazi Holocaust was not the fault just of the Nazis. It was the fault of all of those who refused to assist and also all of those who collaborated with the Nazis. I mean, the Nazis were not just Germans. They were French, they were Russians, they were often even British who went to Germany to fight for the Nazis. And all of these people collaborated. Many Poles helped the Nazis kill Jews, many Romanians, many Bulgarians, and so on and so forth. So it's a collective consciousness of the world that should be shaken by that, not just Germans. I think the lesson that we need to remember is that when a group is victimized, and those of us who are not part of that group and stay aside, pretend we don't pay attention, that eventually will turn against us. Because, at first, as I mentioned before, the Germans did not just go straight for the Jews. They first practiced their genocidal tactics against disabled people, primarily. Homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses were targeted, gypsies, eventually communists, German communists, and then eventually they came to the Jews. And very often you see this chain of events, and the group that knows is the next in that chain does not take a stand to help the other group. And eventually that domino effect leads to the disintegration of the entire society. And so I guess the lesson we should be learning is solidarity, unity with each other. Yes, I specialize in the study of terrorism, and often people tend to associate terrorism with non-state small groups like Al-Qaeda, But in reality, if you look at the history of humanity, you'll see that terrorism is primarily the weapon of large governments, states. Take, for example, the Nazi government, which practiced state, on a huge scale, practiced state terrorism on a huge scale. There's no other word to describe the Nazi regime as a state terrorism. And because they have more resources in their hands, they have more people, they have more money, more weapons, when they do practice terrorism, large-scale structures tend to practice in a wholesale fashion. So, for instance, we tend to kind of, some people think the panic of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda at the time is nothing compared to Nazi Germany. The British, during the bombing of major big British cities by the Germans, they suffered a 9/11 every week, for several years, in fact. And then they pulled together and fought the war and won it. So it's interesting how contemporary generations tend to lose perspective of that, We should be careful about making connections too loosely. I think there is a mild connection in that even though I would classify part of what happened to the African Americans as extermination, okay? It wasn't as rapid as during the Holocaust. That's what makes the Holocaust stand out. It was so rapid, within, say, 10 years or so. Close to 6 million people were killed or exterminated, In the case of the Africans, it lasted for about 2 centuries. The connection that I would make is that in both cases, both groups that were targeted were seen as less than human, and that facilitated eventually mass extermination. I would make actually a bigger connection with the extermination of Native Americans in our continent, not just south of Rio Grande, but also north of the Rio Grande. There were studies that were done that around the time the first Europeans started arriving to what is now the United States, there were about 12 million people that lived here. Within about 100 years or so, 120 years, about 500,000 had survived. So that would classify as massive extermination. However, it wasn't as rapid as during the Holocaust against the Jews. That's what makes it stand out in human history. In Germany, students are taught about the Holocaust almost from day one when they go to school. It's something that they have to do. It's seen as part of their curriculum. I agree with that because often if you tend to sanitize history and make it less controversial in order to avoid some of the contentious subjects like the Holocaust, that runs the danger of actually censoring history. You know, particularly what I want us to remember is the complexity of that era. The fact that, as I mentioned before, it's not just the Nazis that were responsible for the Holocaust. It's all of those who did not do anything about this. And that includes the British and the French, and even the United States in many cases, you know. So we need to learn about the Holocaust, and we need to know about each individual country's responsibility in it. I would also like to share the fact that I mentioned collective responsibility earlier. Mm-hmm. You know, Hitler, even though he facilitated this mass extermination of Jews, he was a good student of history. Hitler took examples from people. One example he often mentioned was the extermination of Armenians in what is now Turkey in the First World War. And he often mentioned, you know, who now remembers of the Armenians? Nobody does. So that means that we have, we have almost like permission to do the same thing ourselves. Many of the Nazi big party officials, when they're taken to Nuremberg for the trial after the war, they said to the American judges, you know, we needed living space and therefore we had to exterminate some of the subhuman species. You did the same with the Native Americans, you know. So who are you to accuse us of trying to find living space for our country when you did the same with in your case back, you know, several centuries ago? And so what I want to say is that often those things that happen throughout history, they lunatic dictators like people like Hitler would use them as stepping stones to achieve their own kind of grand schemes of living space and so on and so forth, as was the case in Germany. And so, you know, it's unfortunate that often even societies like ours would give negative examples that people like Hitler would take, you know, kind of take and run with it, you know. And so I think we need to have some sort of more education in our country about cases like African American extermination or Native American extermination, you know, just to make sure that we deal with it the same way that, say, you know, Turks should deal with the Armenian situation and so on and so forth. And I think more should be happening toward that goal. I think it's inevitable. You know, you understand history, you're condemned to repeat all the mistakes that were made before. History is basically a series of mistakes. That's what human history is about. We often fail to respond to the circumstances around us. And the only way that I know, I'd like to know if there's another solution, but the way I know first to be actually to better ourselves and how we deal with circumstances, political, economic, ecological, and so on and so forth, is to learn what happened before. To face often a common enemy, common danger. I think you can't study the Holocaust deep enough. You can't overstress it in history. It's so important. Often they know the basics of it, like around when it happened, the primary the people responsible for it, but they don't know the small details that are also important. The fact, for instance, that the Holocaust the extermination did not particularly take place in Germany itself. It took place mostly in Poland, German-occupied Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. The fact that the Germans, their first reaction was to send the Jews somewhere else rather than kill them, because it was cheaper to do that, and Palestine was one thing that was mentioned. It was rejected by the British. Madagascar was mentioned as well. It was rejected. Also, people don't know, for example, Reinhard Heydrich, one of the major facilitators of the Holocaust. People like Himmler, people like Rommel, all of these big generals, the German generals and big officials. Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann, the man who helped transport the Jews to the concentration camps, a cold-blooded bureaucrat. All of these very important figures are often lost to students because they always focus on Hitler. You know, the Holocaust was not the result of just one person. My opinion is that Hitler had never existed. There would still have been a Holocaust because he was a product of his time, and things were looking toward rapid ethnic disintegration in Germany anyway. So it wasn't just him, and often students fail to see like the infrastructure of German anti-Semitism.